Okay, the next thing I want to show you is the Angular form. And so the form's over here, and we have the HTML. And now there's some JavaScript down here. This is the Angular JavaScript. I'll show that shortly. Let's just focus on what we have, the structure of the form first. There's a whole load of divs. Let me just collapse some of these divs. So each of these divs represents one section of this this form. There's a parent div here, and what's very important here is we have this ng app, because this attribute, sorry, when you see ng, that means that is short for Angular, and the ng app attribute will tell Angular just over how much of the HTML to exercise control. So this kind of defines the scope. Also, we'll see later that this name needs to tie up with some JavaScript, otherwise it won't work. So you have one ng app per page. At least I think that's the case. But over here we have ng controller. So controller is this part of this model view controller, and because we have a simple example, I've only got the one controller going on here. So if we just let's just go through these divs and see what they do. So the top one is just a welcome message. The second one is here. So the divs are colored in the darker goldenrod. And so what we have here, we have a message, today's top beer, and then we have span, and we have this ng bind. So what that's going to do is that's going to tell Angular to populate the text within this span using the variable today's top beers. So that's that, and then the next one we have another second line. We have a news line, and we have a span. We have an ng bind. So it's going to bind the value. It's going to give the text what it sees in the global variable, in the variable of status. Next we have this button where it says ng click. So this is an Angular click event handler. And so it's going to execute a JavaScript function called take delivery. Okay, so let's just collapse this. Now this is the table section here, and let's just go through this. So this is really interesting. So because the thing is, it's a table, and you want a row for each beer, so you kind of need something that looks like a for each logic. So this line here, it's like a for each loop. So there is a global variable called beers, and that's an array. And so I'm saying here, this is my loop variable. So for each beer in the beers array, we say, okay, so we populate the left-hand cell with brand, and we populate the right-hand cell with country. So these double curly brackets. That's very, very similar, if not identical, to ng bind, which we saw up above. It's just a different syntax, but it does the same thing. It will bind to the variable as can be seen here. Also we say we have a delete control here, so that's just implemented as the multiply symbol. So that's what you're seeing there, and we have some JavaScript event handler to change the color when we move in and move out. So that's how we get the turn the color from red to black. And if you click on it, then we're saying again we have the ng click event handler. So we're saying, okay, call this function called delete beer, and that's it. And it does all the wiring. It's quite clever because not only does it write each row, the text for each row, it will also wire up the right beer to be deleted. So actually what we're doing here is we're saying delete beer by the brand name. So you can pass parameters in. So that's rather clever. So we just collapse this. And then the final section, this is the add beer. Okay, so in this case we don't have ng model. We have we don't have ng bind. We have ng model. They're quite similar, but ng bind is used for one-way binding, whereas ng model is two-way binding. So this is a model is just like your model view controller design pattern, and so ng model means two-way binding in this case. And what we're doing here, because this is an input field, we're saying, okay, if you populate the text, if you see it on your variable, and then if the text is changed by the user, then you update this global variable. So that's two-way binding. And lastly, we have another click handler which says post to beer, which is actually add to beer. So now that we've done that, let's open up JavaScript down here. So this is the Angular JavaScript, and a lot of this needs to tie up, otherwise it won't work. So up here we said ng app, my app, so that has to tie up with this, otherwise it won't work. Here we have we're defining the controller. So most of the work is done, most of the code, all of the code actually is defined within here, except the top line. And what does it do? Let's just collapse this. So we get passed in this global variable called scope. We also get given, we also request a helpful object called $HTTP, which is used to make HTTP requests. So I said up above here, I said, okay, when we click on the take delivery button, then we will call the take delivery function, and we can see that it's defined on the global scope object. So the take delivery function is essentially all it does is it uses the HTTP $service, and it makes a post. You saw the post coming in the previous videos, but here you see the actual code. So most of the time it works. In fact, it very rarely errors out. But if it did error out, you pass in the error callback handler in the second parameter, and you pass in the success callback handler in the first parameter. So because it's a post, nothing comes back other than the status code, so we don't actually dig out any information from the response variable here. All we do is we set the status message, which is actually the news. We simply set that to a new piece of text. But more importantly, what we do is we call the getPeers function. The getPeers function populates the main table. So that's important because the post actually updates the internal state of the server, but in order to get the table refreshed, you're going to have to call the function that actually redraws the table. So that's what that getPeers is there for. So let's take delivery. I suppose I ought to show you the getPeers function since we just referenced it. So again, it's an HTTP call. We call into this URL with the HTTP verb get. And in this instance, something does come back in response. So you pull it out, you say response.data, and so we populate the global variable beers here. And we simply pull out the top beer into a little message. So we're saying, okay, so because we can't erase a 0, begin at 0, so we say beer 0 to give me the first beer. So we say, okay, well, give me the brand and the country, and I'll just put it in a piece of text, and I will put it into a separate global variable here called today's top beers. And you can see that is how this this is what this refers to. So today's top beers, that refers to this top line up here. And although that's the definition of the function, it doesn't actually get called until you actually have a line of code like this. So we can tell it's a function evaluation because it has round brackets at the end, so that's a function evaluation. And the point is that when this gets executed, the script gets executed. All of these are simply defining the functions on a global scope, dollar scope variable. But we actually need to, at some point, we actually need to populate the table, because without it, we don't have any data in the table. So here I've just chosen, after I've defined the function, I've chosen to run the function for the first time. If you look at this post beer is for the add beer. Perhaps we should have called it add beer. But I chose to keep the function names in some instances the same as the HTTP verbs that they refer to. So here we say that the fields that were bound here, you see this ng model, and they're bound to these input fields. They're bound to this variable called add beer. So let's have $scope.addBeer. So if we just pull that into data, and then I'm going to here I do an HTTP call to post, and it's a different URL from the one above, because if you remember, we used post to deliveries. So there's Foo Bar deliveries up here, and here I have Foo Bar beers. So we're posting a beer. You saw that being executed earlier. And as I said earlier, with post, you don't really get much of a response. So what we do is we simply update the status with updated beer. But we also we redraw the beers table. So again, we have to have this function call of get beers again here. So put beer. We don't actually use this, but because actually we don't have anything to amend a beer. But if we were to amend a beer, the convention is to use the put verb on HTTP. We've seen these two. Delete beer and look up beer. Well, let's just look up beer first. Actually, let's look in conjunction. Actually, let's look up here first. So what this does is, all it does is you pass in an array of beers, and it will give, that's the first parameter here. And you also pass in a string for the beer brand, and all it's going to do is it's going to look it up in the array. I dare say there's probably an inbuilt function that does this, but this is just me writing very simple code. The point is that we return the index array if we find it, or if we don't find it, we return -1. This matters because if we're going to delete a beer, we can't just delete anything. We've got to delete the right one. Let's just close this. Let's look at delete beer. So in REST, in order to delete something, use the delete HTTP verb. And what that has done, that will change the state on the server. And we can give an update status message. But we've got a second choice here to say how we're going to handle redrawing the table. In other examples, I've chosen to go $scope.getBeers to redraw the table. Here, I've chosen to save a call because that's an extra network call. Here I've chosen to save the network call by finding the beer in my table, in my array. So you say we look up the beer, and then as long as it's found, we splice means to remove an element. It's quite powerful, but in this instance we have a simple use case where we're simply removing an element. And when that happens, the table will be redrawn because this is bound to the global variable $scope.beers. And if we remove a beer, we may have removed the top beer, and as such, we need to make sure that the top beer message remains consistent. So that's what these extra lines of code at the bottom do. So that's the delete beer. Now, this simply is probably a little more efficient because it saves the network call than actually calling $scope.getBeers again. Obviously, you make a design decision at the time. So, well, I think that's covered the Angular on both the HTML styling and the JavaScript. Now, this is all in one page. Very often, in fact, it's standard to split out the script into its own separate file. But for a simple example, at least for doing a training video, I think it's useful to keep it in the same file because we can just scroll up and down.